Hello and welcome to the channel, my friends. It's Thunderbob here, and tonight we are going to talk about a franchise that is very close to my heart. Resident Evil. This is a series that has basically been there from my earliest gaming days. A series that has grown with me over the years, reinventing itself with each new release and with each new generation. Of all of the game series I have enjoyed over the decades, Resident Evil has the most impressive release cadence, while also maintaining a very high level of quality, with just a few missteps over the years. I've been playing these games at release for nearly 30 years now, but I've come to realize that while I've replayed a few of the games many times, like Resident Evil 4, there are a few that I've not played since that original release date many years ago, and there are at least 2 mainline games that I never actually completed. So my plan is to replay every mainline release in the series, including all of the numbered titles and the remakes. And I'm going to throw in Code Veronica and Revelations 1 and 2, even though it's debatable if those are mainline games. I'm going to play through the games in release order, and then put together a review and retrospective for each game individually. I intend to contrast my memories and feelings playing these games originally, years and decades ago, against how the games hold up today. I'm going to play through these games on the PC where available, and for the older titles with graphical mods to try to play these in the best possible light today. When I'm done with the entire series, I want to do a final video with my overall thoughts on the series and a ranking of all of the games. And a warning here, there will be some spoilers, but let's go ahead and get started. Tonight we will be discussing Resident Evil Revelations. And this is another spin-off game that I had never actually played before. This came out during a period in the series that I was mostly just over the Resident Evil franchise. Resident Evil 6 had left just such a bad first impression with that demo release that I swore off the game and really just stopped caring about the series for a couple of years until Resident Evil 7 was released. So Revelations 2 was released back in 2015, and even though this game was designed for home consoles, in my mind it was the sequel to that portable game and just not really worth checking out. But now that I finally played this game, I realized I made a big mistake. Both of the Revelations games are really quite good. They feel more like classic Resident Evil games than the mainline games released during this era. They're a bit smaller scale and episodic, but I honestly think that works in the game's favor. So now I'm coming to this game for the first time in 2025, and I gotta say, it largely holds up. Graphically, it looks pretty nice still. This game is now about 10 years old. Kind of crazy to think 2015 is a decade ago. And while it's not quite as huge in scale and with a lot less variety, I'd say it looks pretty comparable to Resident Evil 6, which was a 2012 release, about 2.5 years prior to the release of Revelations 2. But that game was a much bigger budget. This is kind of like a spin-off budget title in my mind. Overall, there's a good cohesion to all the locations in the game. I liked the art direction of the island. The enemies are really frightening looking, though there are a limited number of models that get repeated pretty frequently. The playable characters are all modeled nicely, have a good look to them, plus there are a bunch of silly alternate costumes available. There's an occasional lower resolution texture here or there, but otherwise, it holds up quite nicely for being 10 years old. So let's talk about the structure of the game and the story of the game. First off, this game was originally released episodically, and upon release of the final chapter, a complete version was released. The game is structured almost like a television show with a preview of the next episode and a recap between each episode. It makes sense with the episodic release structure, but feels a bit redundant when you're playing them back to back in the full release. Each episode is separated into 2 chapters, one from Claire Redfield and Moira Burton's perspective, and the other from Barry Burton and Natalia Corda. Moira being the daughter of Barry Burton from the original Resident Evil, and Natalia is an orphan girl whose parents died in the Terra Grigia attack, which ties back into the first Revelations game. Unlike the previous Revelations game that had a large number of perspectives, I really like how this game focuses on a smaller cast of characters, and there's a really strong family story that's told here. And the game here takes place between Resident Evil 5 and 6, and it starts out with Claire working for a company named TerraSave. They're a biohazard prevention agency, and Moira is a new hire. The company is attacked at an event, and Claire and Moira are kidnapped and wake up on a creepy island. They explore a prison and run into these new infected enemies known as the Afflicted, who are more like horror movie slasher monsters like Leatherface or Jason, relentlessly rushing and screaming. They also constantly receive messages from a mysterious voice through a band attached on their wrist who comes to be known as the Overseer. Moira refuses to use any guns and primarily shines a flashlight or uses melee weapons. And the pair escape the prison and explore the island, and then send a message for help from a radio tower that they find. And that's where the Barry Burton section picks up. Barry Burton has just arrived on the same island, and he very quickly runs into Natalia, a young mysterious girl who appears to have powers. She can sense the monsters on the island. She primarily uses power to identify enemies and weak points on those enemies, but she can also pick up bricks to use as weapons. There's a new enemy called the Revenant, who are kind of like the Regenerators from Resident Evil 4. You have to use Natalia to identify the weak spots on them and then shoot them. This pair makes their way through much of the same path that Claire and Moira had gone through in the first section, and they eventually find their way to the radio tower, where we learn that the call for help that Barry is following is actually 6 months old. And this is essentially the format for most of the game. Claire and Moira explore a location, and then Burton and Natalia will explore the same location 6 months later with a slightly different layout, encounters, and story beats. So Claire and Moira explore a small village area with a bar and several buildings. They also run into some other survivors abducted from TerraSave. The Overseer's voice comes over and taunts the player many times and sets up tons of traps and scenarios. It kind of feels a bit like Saw at times. They look for parts for a helicopter, but upon fixing it, the Overseer calls in an attack and nearly everyone dies. And you learn that this is all some sick experiment and everyone has been infected with a new virus, and if you get too scared, you transform into a new type of infected. Claire and Moira run into Natalia, but lose her very shortly thereafter. This cuts back to Barry and Natalia going through many of the same areas of the village, except now there are these invisible bugs that only Natalia can see, that Barry has to shoot before they get to you and one-shot kill you. They reach the central tower of the island and are ambushed by the Overseer, and it cuts to Chapter 3. And here, Claire and Moira are exploring an industrial area and a meat processing plant, and then they go through some sewers. They then head for the central tower on the island, where they run into Neil, a TerraSave boss, who it turns out had betrayed his friends and let them get captured in the original attack. And he seems to have some allegiance to Lonsdale and the FBC, kind of tying this back into the first Revelations game, but the connection was a little bit lost on me. I wasn't completely following the story bit here. Now, Neil is transformed into a giant hulking tyrant-like boss, and a crazy fight ensues, and in the end, either Moira or Claire can take the final shot to put him down, and this single choice will determine if you get the good ending or the bad ending. So if you want the good ending, spoiler, let Moira take that shot on Neil. And it turns out that Moira hates guns because she accidentally shot her sister with one of her father's guns, which strained their relationship. And Barry also holds a lot of guilt as well because he yelled at Moira even though he had left the guns unlocked. Barry has this kind of surrogate father thing going with Natalia, and as a father to an 8-year-old girl and someone who's lost my own parents just a couple years ago, this story stuck pretty close to home for me. So the second half of that chapter cuts back to Barry, who manages to escape from the Overseer with Natalia, and he travels back through the sewers and into a mine facility. And there are a number of puzzles here where you need to move these big generators around on tracks, and then another big boss. And then the Overseer catches you again, but Natalia does something to frighten her away and the chapter ends. And this cuts back to Claire and Moira, who climb to the top of that tower and they find the Overseer, and it's revealed that the Overseer is actually Alex Wesker, sister to Albert Wesker, who monologues to you for several minutes. And I guess the plan was that she took over this island and started experimenting on the locals. And And this new virus she created is somehow key to immortality, and particularly overcoming fear is the critical point to overcoming mortality, I guess. And this comes into play because Natalia, the little girl, survived the Terra Grigia attack and is basically afraid of nothing. So Alex actually wants to use Natalia as a vessel to kind of like transfer her consciousness, it seems like. It's a little vague how all this, you have to read through some files and stuff, but that's kind of the gist of what she's trying to do here. The crazy part is she monologues and tells you all this stuff, and then she lifts her gun to her head and she shoots herself. And this triggers a self-destruct, and Claire and Moira have 5 minutes to escape the tower. On the way out, Moira gets trapped under some rubble and appears to die as Claire barely jumps to safety in time. And then this cuts back to Barry, who is with a rescued Claire on the mainland, who finds out Moira is dead. And then the game cuts to 6 months later. Barry receives a message from Moira, returns to the island, starting the game. So Barry and Natalia pass through a toxic mine before reaching Alex's research facility that looks suspiciously like the Spencer Mansion. They encounter Alex, who injects herself again and further mutates, and you have a boss fight with Alex. Now here's where that good and bad ending come into play. So if you had Moira take the shot on Neil, she will appear and rescue Barry. It turns out that she survived the tower collapse and lived for 6 months on the island. She saves Barry. They escape. And then there is another fight with Alex, and Claire shows up in a helicopter. She fights with a sniper rifle where Barry is on the ground using his pistols. And then, of course, a rocket launcher is involved, and Alex gets taken down for good. They all escape on the helicopter together, and then it cuts to sometime later. Claire is traveling in a car, and she's hearing all about the China situation from Resident Evil 6. And she's kind of just ignoring that and says that Piers is going to take care of it, even though Piers, I think, would have been dead by this point, but I digress. She goes to Barry's house with a present, and Moira and Natalia and Barry all live together. It seems like Natalia has been adopted, but then it cuts to Natalia, and she's acting kind of creepy and reading Kafka, which was what Alex was reading, and it's kind of implied that Alex may have actually transferred consciousness, or maybe there's a shared consciousness. Something's going on. I don't know if they're setting up a future plot point here, but it is kind of a happy ending, but kind of a downer as well. So that's the story, and I feel like it's pretty strong. It's not this huge world-ending threat like the last couple games, but instead a more personal story about a father trying to save his daughter. On a character level, it is one of the stronger stories, and it really resonated with me. I loved that Barry got a larger part. He's been missing since that original game, and I kind of love the little father-daughter thing he had going on with almost all the characters. And I really just got his due that I felt he deserved all the way from the original game. He was pretty awesome in that game. And beyond the campaign, there's also a raid mode, much like the first Resident Evil Revelations game. And you can play this solo or cooperatively, and it's basically like a horde mode where you revisit kind of remixed locations from the base game to earn points and upgrade your character, upgrade weapons, earn weapons. I've only put an hour or so into this, just poking around with it. It seems really cool. I've read that it's pretty comparable to the first game. I plan to put some more time into this, but it definitely will extend the replayability of this game. So let's talk about gameplay. This game plays very similarly to the first Revelations game, except you can switch between the two primary characters at any time, very much like Resident Evil 0, but I think they actually got that switching mechanic correct here, where 0 is kind of frustrating. The AI works quite well and generally stays out of trouble. You mostly use the switching mechanic to solve puzzles or to utilize some ability or tool the other character possesses. Otherwise, the controls are quite responsive. You can move and aim in typical Resident Evil fashion, but you also get a new dodge button. You can also quick switch between 4 weapons, and there's a quick press for throwing grenades or using healing items. You can also move and shoot, something that not a lot of these games have, but you do move pretty slow, so I think it's kind of compensated for. And the game is quite scary, both from the atmosphere, but also from the number of enemies and the lack of resources the game provides. Early on, I constantly felt like I needed to avoid enemies or simply run away. And there are a few sequences early on that were a bit frustrating where the game clearly is throwing more enemies than you have the bullets to kill, but I wasn't always clear on how they wanted me to progress, how to avoid them, what was the next thing to trigger to move the story forward, basically. It wasn't much of an issue later. I ended up getting so much ammo by the end of the game, it was actually kind of easy. And there's also frequent saves, so if you do die, it just takes you back like 30 seconds. So it's not like you're losing a lot of progress or anything. And it does lead to some very adrenaline-filled moments early on in the game. The game also gives you a decent amount of options to customize your playstyle. There are weapon kits spread around the map which allow you to upgrade your weapons, both increasing damage, capacity, reload speed, but also adding new mechanics like burst fire or charge shots. You also earn points while playing that you can use between chapters to upgrade skills that augment your weapons and abilities. And there's also a ton of hidden items to find that increase things like ammo capacity or inventory space. And with all these different upgrade mechanics, it gives you a good incentive to scour the locations for secrets. There's tons of secrets all over the place here. So a lot of exploration in this game. There's also a rudimentary crafting system here that feels a lot like The Last of Us. Crafting Molotov cocktail, smoke bombs, exploding bombs, and such from scavenged resources. You also craft healing items like bandages to stop you from bleeding out and wipes to wipe your eyes from certain enemies that explode, otherwise you're blinded for a time. And overall, I gotta say, the gameplay here is much more my style than Resident Evil 6, which was the last game I played through. The combat is slower paced and more methodical. There are encounters that feel like every shot counts, and the slower pace lets you really think about your next move. There are real survival horror aspects, and resource management is really required. You get way more option to customize your playthrough, and the game gives you reasons to explore, and the locations are much more reminiscent of the earlier games. You don't feel like you're just sprinting through to the next set piece. The game also has a lot of puzzles. Some of them involve the character switching mechanic, using one character to turn a crank to open a sluice, while the other travels through, that sort of thing. There's also frequent puzzles used to unlock chests that got kind of repetitive. I just wish there was a way to skip this. That's a little frustrating. But the normal puzzles overall were pretty inventive. Overall, a ton more puzzles than the last few mainline games, but nothing that really took that much brain power or frustration. So, final thoughts. I really enjoyed the Revelations games, and would love for Capcom to work on more small-scale projects like this between the larger games. Fill in the big gaps in the timeline between games, or make a game that explores an event that was only described but never experienced in the game. The episodic structure is also interesting. While I think that industry has mostly turned away from this experiment, I think this formula can still work for a project of this scope. The only real negatives I can think of here is some of the backtracking through the same area as Barry could feel a bit tedious, but things have changed enough with new enemies and routes that it's only a minor complaint. I would also have appreciated a full map. You can find maps in the overworld, but it just sticks a mini-map in the corner of your screen with no way to access the full view.
Barry, shoot this thing in my way.
I've really found it surprising that I've found myself enjoying the spin-off Revelation games more than the mainline games that came between them. This is a smaller scale game, but it also feels way more personal, has a great story. The gameplay is quite fun, and it's a good balance between the older Resident Evil styles and the more modern action-packed games. It has a good balance of action, survival, exploration, resource management that make this, in my mind, a true Resident Evil experience. So if you've avoided the Revelations games because you thought they were spin-offs or not a true Resident Evil game, I think you might have made a mistake, as these games are totally worth checking out. Alright, so we're going to end it there. I do appreciate everyone who has watched through the series. If you enjoy this, if you got any comments, please drop a message below. Like, subscribe, all that jazz, and just keep an eye out. I'll have future videos. It may be more like 2 weeks between them as these games get longer later in the series, and I'm also doing some trips this summer, but I will try to release them at a decent cadence. Again, thank you and have a good night.